Hello and welcome to this video. Today we're joined by Karol in the studio, who is a first year philosophy and theology student at St Andrews. We study the same course and he is doing some very interesting work on phenomenology and existentialism. So we're going to be talking about some of the ideas that he's working on, which will be building up towards a book, which, if I have remembered correctly, should be coming out sometime next year. So I'm very looking forward to this discussion and I hope you will enjoy this discussion. Karol, how are you?
I'm doing well, thanks, Josh. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well. So, to get started off with this whole discussion, what brings you into phenomenology and existentialism? Because when people come into the broad field of theology or philosophy, they might be saying, oh, I want to go into natural theology, or maybe I want to go into analytic philosophy. But then phenomenology and existentialism, at least continental philosophy, is a bit on the niche side. What drew you to it?
Yeah. I think phenomenology existentialism is definitely far more sort of Germanic. You know, you get people from Germany and France, and it's far less Anglo-Saxon as a form of philosophy. But I think for me, it had particular pertinence because of the existential angst in our generation, in particular. I think the big questions which pervade the psychic consciousness of our epoch is no longer the questions necessarily of the universe per se, the cosmogonic questions of what is the the permeating form of rationality. Think about the pre-Socratics or Aquinas metaphysics. These things are still very important, don't get me wrong, but I feel like to our generation, first and foremost, we are preoccupied with the question of existence, which Kierkegaard posed in the 19th century. So those to me are sort of, I think, on a personal level, I suppose that was one of the reasons why I was interested in these questions, because I mean, you could have an understanding of the universe, but if you don't understand how to live within it, then it seems to me that you're no different from being lost at the same time. So that was probably the initial stage going into it. Yeah.
So you raised Kierkegaard as one of those thinkers, and of course Kierkegaard and angst is a very big kind of connection there. Would you say any other thinkers perhaps influenced you before we delve into the three main ideas behind this book? People like Heidegger, I'm guessing, or maybe Hegel,
Mm. Yeah.
or such figures.
Yeah, Kierkegaard was a big influence for me. I think growing up, this book is really just honestly, to some extent, it's a testament to my life. Nietzsche says that every great philosophy is an unconscious autobiography, and I think to some extent for me that's what the book kind of represented. Because when I had my the good old existential crisis which everyone has at some point, these were sort of the questions I was wrestling with in some sense. My belief in God was probably not necessarily the biggest of concerns. These are things which metaphysics is dealing with. But it was more so the question of even of identity really, and sort of the existential relation to the epistemic concepts which pervade our forever pervade human existence. Because when you think about the nature of human philosophy, in the nature of philosophy in general, I mean, um, it's a case where we haven't really the fundamental questions which concern human existence haven't really changed per se. The only things that have changed is sort of the individual responses to them as a result of the manner of experience and the mode of thinking which is born within a particular epoch. So the great thinkers, Aquinas wouldn't have probably have not been able to sort of conceptualize the existential concerns which we have today regarding things like sexuality and identity. At the same time, though, we are also far removed from his preoccupation with trying to bring in the truths of Aristotelian philosophy back into a more sort of Catholic dogmatic sort of theological perspective. So in some sense, really, I think fundamentally, what I was interested in is a deeper question of, okay, beyond truth per se, how can I try to find something which is true for me, as Kierkegaard would put it, right? So, I mean, loads of other people, Kierkegaard is definitely one influence, but as I got deeper and deeper into it, I mean, Heidegger is, is a fascinating influence. I think my philosophy teacher actually, my philosophy A level teacher was a big fan of Heidegger. Take away some of the other things, but and the question of being was very interesting as well, because I mean, ultimately, how can you know who what you could become, or what you should live for, if you don't know who you are, right? And the fundamental question of identity of human being, the human subject, and how he should exist in the world, separate from the mind body, the mind body mind world distinction, which came about by the sort of Descartes and the rationalist tradition, trying to fully understand what is fundamental to human nature. I think that was what I really found very interesting about phenomenology and Husserl and Heidegger in particular. We've got other people. Obviously, Nietzsche for me is a very big influence. I would say Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. We've got Patočka, who's a far less known philosopher. He's a Czech, um, Prague philosopher. He's called the Socrates of Prague. Actually, his life
Mm.
is also something immensely fascinating to look into. And we've got Jung, we've got Foucault, we've got Levinas, and I think those are about really the main people who have kind of influenced the project. Shestov as well. He's
Mm.
a less known thinker, but also a big influence for me. He was influenced by all three of the existential giants as well. Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. So those are sort of the main people who influenced my project at the moment. Yeah, those are the people I read voluminously, and then taking on all the influences from everywhere else, really.
Yeah, no, that does sound interesting. I mean, you do have a really wide diversity of Christian, theistic, non-theistic, atheistic, whatever you want to call it, kind of
Mm,
thinkers tied in there. And I suppose before we get into the actual, I suppose, content of your research and your work, which I am very, very interested in, I'll just like you raised about Catholicism and faith. I suppose for the viewers who are watching this, they might, I suppose, the underlying question they might have is actually what is your religious background, and if you, or at least if and if so, how does your religious background influence your existential, I suppose, angst or your existential wrestling with
mm,
with being and the world? Because in some sense they are, I suppose, very similar but very at the same time very different. I suppose
yeah.
fields. So how do you
Mm,
kind of compare
yeah.
them together?
So I'm Catholic. I'm, yeah, devout Catholic. I would like to say, but
Mm,
we do our best anyway. Um, and I think, regards to my existential angst, I think, yeah, fundamentally for me, honestly, my belief in God was a big was a big cause of my existential angst. One of the reasons for it, not necessarily because I've ever doubted the existence of God, but because if you move from, I lived in Africa. I lived in Cameroon for 12 years before I came to England, right? And in Africa,
mm,
there's a very different, Taylor actually touched on this actually. And what I've realized as well with the Greco-Roman tradition is it's actually very similar in the bulwarks of belief, and the sort of the notion of identity and the structures of identity are actually very, very different in Africa compared to the West at the moment. So Taylor talks about something, Charles Taylor, he talks about something called enchantment. And this is the belief that the spiritual and the material world are physically are sort of intertwined. And, in some sense, then it creates a buffer zone. And this buffer zone is what we could call um, ideas which are sort of intuitive and sort of self-evident. Now, within every society will have a buffer zone to some extent. Every epoch will have a buffer zone to some extent. These are the ideas and beliefs which are self-evident and intuitive. And what you realize is that in Africa, the mode of thinking, and this is also the case in other countries. Some other countries as well. Like I think that, well, no, Asia is a totally different place altogether. But I'd say probably some parts of South America as well. This is definitely the case as well. You see, the fact that belief in God is really not something which is questioned a ridiculous amount. It's kind of very much intuitive and self evident, and because of that, there's a very strong wellspring of spirituality in Africa, and there's also the sense in which I think we are definitely far more communitarian. So when you come to the West, then you see a different shift because what you see is you know what I saw, I felt was really the strong sense of individuality, which the West kind of carries and emphasizes. I mean, if you live in Cameroon, for example, you would probably know almost all your neighbors, and you'd probably be very friendly with all. You could walk probably a few miles away, and you probably know a few people here and there you could say hi to. I think in the West is definitely quite different. You don't know that many people. You're just kind of doing your own thing, and everyone's doing their own thing, and that's the way it works. So what am I trying to get at with all of these different things? What I'm trying to get at is the problem of identity is far more pervasive in the West than it is back home. And when I came to the West, then I think the intuitiveness of my belief systems, not only because I was young, but because of the structure, the society which I lived in, I think it was definitely a case where like I had to kind of I had to kind of address that. I had to kind of, I felt challenged, in some sense,
Mm,
by my beliefs, and I had to really kind of question myself. Well, why is it that I believe in what I believe in? And I think if you want to say where's, where, how's my faith going to influence that, I think that would be one thing, really. I mean, not even not even just Africa. I mean, Catholicism in general has always been far more focused on being universalist. The Protestant revolution is the more individual emphasis. Yeah, the more individual emphasis. Catholicism in general has always been more sort of we're trying to unite and conform. So I think that definitely coming to the West, I think that was kind of where it was challenged. The other thing was, I think I've always been very interested in the problem of identity regards to um okay, this is especially something which came up, I think, with the Second Vatican Council. I think this was a concern which came up, and with especially with figures like Newman, at the end of the 19th century, talking about this stuff. I was quite interested in stuff like, you know if I were to live my life, say, this is a question, if I were to live my life, say, um authentically believe that God does not exist, for example, would I go to hell? These were the kind of questions I was interested in. I was interested also in the question of sameness and difference, as in, if I believe that, genuinely believe that God exists, how should I interact with people who differ from me? Um, to what degree can I accept or disagree? And when do I allow this disagreement to actually, not sort of not tear apart relations, but actually sort of augment our sense of authenticity and all these different things. So for me, really, I think I was very interested in the question of truth, really, and just like, everyone is saying all these things, and all these great philosophers are saying all these things, and they're all immense geniuses, but they're all saying contradictory things. So ultimately, then, what is kind of universal about human nature or human identity, and how can we grow from this universal understanding to prevent any problems of sectarianism, which have arisen, especially especially in the past. Really, you see this a lot with the heretics and all that kind of stuff, the burning of the heretics and stuff like that. I mean, you really want to try and make sure that identity doesn't become something that delimits possibility.
mm. Yeah, that's interesting. That's a very interesting kind of, I suppose, theological backdrop for the rest of this discussion. And you do touch upon the question of identity, and this ties into one of your key themes of the project, which is, I suppose, how are we meant to approach human nature, and what does I suppose, a human nature comprise of? And I suppose you would then apply phenomenology and existential, I suppose, thought and processes to it. Can you
Mm,
just perhaps lay out a brief kind of groundwork or a framework for your project, and perhaps you could delve into it a bit further after that?
mm, okay. Yeah, the main aim of the project is to develop a hermeneutic, or what, in other words, a mode of interpretation,
Mm,
which can allow us to maximize human potential to the fullest. By doing so, we first have to have an understanding of who we are, and moving from that understanding, we could go into what we could become. So I think the analogy would probably be something like what Aristotle said in the Ethics, where he said that, if we understand the function of a chair, if we understand the function of a chair, I think that's what he said, we could understand, if we understand what a chair is made of, we could understand what its function is, or all these sort of moving from an understanding of who we are to where we could become. All these sort of, if you understand the material cause, then you can understand the instrumental cause. I think that's what I was trying to get at here. So ultimately, then, it's a case where I'm trying to understand what is fundamental to human nature, and this is where phenomenology obviously helps me immensely, because phenomenology is going against the extremely hardcore scientific um reductivist tradition, which comes along with the Cartesian, and even the logical positivist early 20th century. um and what we're trying to do is sort of find out what is, what we do is we make a phenomenological reduction. We reduce the question of the sort of whether or not the world actually exists, or whether or not we actually are not in dreams, but in reality, or all these kind of questions of howness or whatness, and all these, and we simply accept the world as it signifies, in terms of its significance, in terms of what it means for us. And from this meaning of the world, from considering the world as an abode, as our home, as sort of the horizon of human lived experience and how it discloses itself to us, we can then move from this understanding to an understanding of what we could become. But this understanding then, of course, must include certain precepts, which I'm already trying to uncover here. It must include faith as our fundamental ontology, rather than apodictic certainty or reason. So okay, I'll try and reduce that one more time. Really, to summarize, it's really just what is fundamental to human nature. If we were to strip ourselves, if we look at a table, for example, this is what Heidegger says. The first thing you see is not black atoms or brown atoms or whatever. You see a table as just something for your use. You see it as its instrumental purpose. That's just a table. So in some sense, really, you can see that what the way we see the world is never really objective. It's always tainted by a subjective lens, and that subjective lens and that subjective horizon is essentially a human horizon. Is the construct of human identity in some sense, right?
Mm,
And from that understanding of human identity, then we can then say, okay, if this is key to my nature and who I am as a person, then what does this mean about what I could become? And so then you have to investigate the question of the life world, because you see, the interaction with the table, for example, is really more so just pointing towards a manner of experience. But an experience is part of what I call the fourfold aspect of the life world, which is belief, will, knowledge, and experience. So ultimately, then, if you understand the nature of the life world, then you can start to understand quite a few things about, you know, human nature, what it is that people do, how they interact, and what it is that causes the differences in identity. Um, in some sense, you could say that fundamentally there is perhaps maybe there is some objective truth which we're all trying to grasp towards, and maybe definitely the scientific tradition has done some work in that, the philosophical tradition as well. With all the arguments we rebut, and we can safely say that those are fallacious. Um, at the same time, we can see that, as Nietzsche says, we always approach it from a particular perspective. Even within Catholicism, for example, there are disagreements even between the saints about different things, and I think partly that's part of the beauty of plurality. Is the fact that we can disagree with each other, um and nonetheless be educated by the same purpose. That seems to me to suggest that we are educated by values that transcend ourselves, and that to me is the harbinger of both purpose and a sort of vulnerability, which is sort of which is indicative of humility, right? The
mm,
humility which is part of the human self as a creature, as a creaturely object, rather than the creator himself. So
mm.
I think, yeah, fundamentally, that's kind of where I approach the question of the aim of the project.
Mm. So you do touch upon, I suppose, the search for this fundamental human nature and this almost this defining of the human being as this phenomenal, as a creature which experiences well, which is thrown into the world in many ways. And I suppose the question there, and you raise it yourself about, I suppose, naturalistic and this reductive naturalistic presentation of humanity versus, I suppose, a more existential or phenomenological approach of it. Where would you draw the line between, I suppose, the need for naturalistic kind of basis of what humanity means and I suppose the definition of what it means to be human purely from a phenomenological framework? Because to me, I suppose a good example of this would be like AI or even like an animal. Maybe like Scooby Doo's like a dog, right? The dog seems to be somewhat conscious. He experiences the world, perhaps even like a human with a certain, I suppose, perception of
Mm,
the world. But then
mm,
nuance or intuition would say that's not a human being, even if phenomenologically that's identical to a human being. I'm not saying Scooby Doo is, but I suppose that hopefully illustrates the point. I was wondering whether you kind of where you can actually draw the line between the two, and whether actually this need to say, oh, a human being has to be biologically human is a very
mm,
important distinction, or could we
mm,
extend that to Scooby Doo perhaps if he had the same phenomenological experience as we did?
okay. Yeah, I think, um yeah, that's very interesting, because I think it's pretty much showing the distinction which I'm trying to break down at the moment, to some extent, between um the sort of the mind and the subject and the object, which is a very Cartesian distinction. I think it's definitely been quite helpful. It was a big shift in philosophy when it did happen. However, I think the incidental existential effects of the scientific revolution and the Cartesian subject-object distinction has definitely been quite harmful with regards to the notion of identity. Um, Now, to answer the question more directly, I suppose I'll give an example of this. When Carl Sagan was taking some scientists up until to Mars, and they were like, "What if we meet Martians?" And essentially, Carl Sagan put it two discs. So first of all, he created one disc, and it was just like all about you know all the scientific processes going on in our body and all the things that go on in our world. All the different scientific chemical compositions. But then they realized, but none of this is actually going to tell you what it feels like to eat an ice cream, and say, "Oh, this is delicious," or to just have just have fun, and just do whatever you want. So that element of human lived experience, which went beyond just purely describing stuff to the descriptive, to an experiential mode of being, is something which those scientists had to realize and incorporate into their project. Now, in some sense, you could say, isn't that pretty much a phenomenological aspect which scientists had to deal with in some sense, fundamentally, because they had to give an appropriate understanding of identity. That's exactly, I think, the heart of it. When you think about love, for example, it's definitely a case where people like Air would like to say that love is simply just serotonin levels and stuff like that. But suppose you were to talk to someone who you loved, and they are to ask you, you know, do you love me, and why do you love me? And you're like, "Ah, I have more serotonin, when I kiss you or whatever." It'll be a totally unromantic thing to say to anyone. And so ultimately, then you have to think about the values that extend beyond physicalist reductive sort of machinations and construction. You have to ask yourself, what is it about love which has always fascinated, for example, poets and philosophers alike? What is it about us that even now, for example, we use words like this is a mystical experience. I felt like I was in cloud nine. And these are words which are used by atheists or religious alike. I recently I watched an interview a while ago where Sam Harris describes consciousness as a miracle. And now that's very interesting, because then when you think about what Taylor again calls the cross pressure in our society today, it's a case where we feel the need to describe certain scientific reductivist experiences by utilizing religious language and terminology. And that's very interesting then, because you ask the question, why is this happening? And this is also what I think is happening because of this plurality of identity, and the ever raising a necessity of asking the question of universality beyond mere sectarianism. We've already had these big debates in the past, with different religious sects and different people exploring all these different things, how to defend the faith. And these are still questions which affect us today. But I feel like right now, and especially at the moment, this is not what is gravitating. This is not the key question which is afflicting our psychic consciousness. With the ever increasing globalization and democracy, and the question of liberty, the problem of liberty. I think these are sort of the questions which we're faced with. So then you could then go back to what is it about human lived experience? Where will you draw the line? I think you really have to draw the line when you ask yourself, you know, what you can live without. In some sense, you can't live without a why. You can't live without a philosophy. Even just the act of living itself entails that you're not, you're not being nihilistic. You're not living within a self-contained value structure. You actually have something you believe in, and that's something which you're forced to. It's part of your thrownness, to use the words of Heidegger. So ultimately, then you could say, if you are called to be something rather than nothing, um, then that is what is fundamental to your nature. You know, the pre-Socratics, for example, um, they're probably maybe not necessarily the best examples, but if you want to, these are people who were investigating both the natural and the existential life world. But you see, Socrates came along and said, okay, never mind, we should just totally get rid of all of this stuff and just focus on moral questions. But you see, no one ever really thought that, you know, it's not that we, that's a big question about whether or not we agree or disagree with Socrates. That's a totally different question. But no one ever really thought that it was not essential to philosophy. It's never not been essential to philosophy to deal with questions of human identity or nature. But in terms of the naturalistic, naturalistic sort of distinctions which these philosophers were preoccupied with, the logos and fire, Heraclitus and water, Thales, all these different things, the apeiros, we don't deal with these things fundamentally in philosophy anymore. Think about sort of the great philosopher, the Persian polemat Avicenna. Um, when he was 18, he was apparently one of the world-renowned Aristotelian, sort of philosophers at the time, and it's a crazy achievement. But what's more interesting is this: Avicenna at that age, to become one of the world's leading philosophers, he had to be quite well learned in physics, astronomy, cosmology, and all these kind of things to actually be a philosopher. In some sense, to be a world-renowned philosopher. In some sense, you think about how compartmentalized sort of knowledge has become right now, and where even in we don't even need to talk about philosophy. Let's talk about mathematics, right? The last universalist we had in mathematics was Hilbert in the 20th century. So knowledge is becoming increasingly compartmentalized, but nonetheless, the questions of existence have never stopped being asked. And in fact, they have been asked with far more ferocity than ever before in human history, currently at the moment. In our generation, there's been no other generation than ours which has faced the question of identity far more ferociously. I mean, think about the debate at the moment with regards to gender pronouns and stuff like that. Think about sort of the existential angst at the moment, where people feel increasingly both disenchanted from the scientific tradition and the reductivist tradition, but also from the church and religion as a whole. And the reason for that is, you see, and this is why people, I think, are gravitating towards psychology at the moment a lot. There's been an increasing shift towards psychology and psychological explanations, because I think in some sense, really, there's a disenchantment with religion, perhaps to an extent, but there's also disenchantment with the scientific reductive tradition because it doesn't really offer the questions which are being posed by the life world. So of course, now, of course, as a Christian, I would say definitely the things that we could be done about that. And I wouldn't necessarily say that I wouldn't necessarily say the problems with religion per se, but it's definitely the questions which we have at the moment are definitely far more far ranging than simply how do we defend Christianity. I think the bigger question is at the moment for us, youth, is um how do we live? How do we construe our identity?
So you raise a very interesting challenge of human identity that people wrestle with, and in the past, that I suppose that has been expressed in philosophy in different ways. You have examples like thesis of ship. Am I still the same person if every part of me has changed? Or someone could conceptualize the challenge of human identity as a challenge to say, well, all right, what does it mean to be human? What makes humans special or separate from an animal and whatnot? But then it seems to me that the crisis of human identity that we're discussing now in our modern age seems to go way deeper than that. It's not really like, oh, well, am I still the same person tomorrow as I am today? Well, most people would say
Mm,
yes without much concern.
mm,
Most people
mm,
wouldn't say, oh, why are humans more special than animals? I mean, you do have vegans, but that's not really the concern of identity. I suppose that's more of an ethical question, which we will touch upon later in this video. So, what do you think is that crisis of identity? Because there clearly is a crisis of identity, but I suppose I'm not exactly sure where we can pin that specific question to,
mm,
if there is even a question that we could pin it to.
yes, that is it's a very interesting question. Where is the crisis of identity? Hmm. I think the question, the crisis of identity, I think exactly what you just said right now, it can't really be pinned down to one question. But I think you really, if you're talking about who predicted this more accurately, probably than anyone, well, the two people who predicted this probably more accurate than anyone else is Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, right?
Mm,
I think what Kierkegaard predicted was the more individual crisis in some sense. The truth was just true for me. And he lived that probably quite forthrightly with his own life and all the sacrifices he had to make to get to where he had. But you can see that crisis of identity, if you were to pin it down in some sense, even though it can't be pinned down, you'll pin it down to the fact that we, as a generation, we are preoccupied with far more. We're trying to figure out the truth which is true for us. Just think about it. you know, we are no longer faced with the problem of conformity, right? The problem of conformity was something which people back then had to face. You think about Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals. He says we had, the notion of Schulden, guilt and debt. So essentially, within the social structure back then, it was a case where you had to conform in order to be accepted and not be penalized. So forms of punishment back then, judicial forms of punishment, were far more based on whether or not necessarily whether or not you were right or wrong, but whether or not you were um, distancing yourself from the norm, because it was essential that people did not do that if they wanted to survive within society. And so you think about even the Old Testament, right? We have this notion of you know if you have a skin disease or whatever, you should self-isolate for 7 days because you are unclean. And you realize the words there, unclean, they don't say because it's to prevent further infection. It's a case of, it's almost seen as a form of punishment as well. In that sense, then you could say that, you know or think about even the heretics. The notion of miasma, which is a very a far more Greco-Roman concept really than the Roman one, but I mean the far more Greco-Roman concept than the Christian one, but nonetheless it still affected our Christian consciousness, because we definitely had this sort of hysteria where it's like, you know if you were a heretic spreading this stuff, then people were going to die, or we're going to go to hell and whatever. So it was very important that we got rid of you. These were the kind of questions which afflicted us back then, but not now. Really, no one's really concerned with whether or not you believe in this or that, or whether or not you want to be this or that. That's technically, that's your concern. It's your problem. That's your decision to make. It's perfectly up to you what you want to become, as long as it doesn't harm other people, right? Mill's concept of harm principle. But essentially now we are far more concerned with the question of like, who I am, who am I as a person, right? And where am I going? So finding the truth is true for me. Think about the categories of sexuality, right? Foucault talks about this in his history of sexuality. The fact that these modes of expression and these categories which we use to describe ourselves, Foucault is asking the more interesting question of whether or not we are not being controlled by the very categories which we use to define ourselves and our modes of identity, whether or not we are not demiliting our possibility, because delimiting our possibility. Because when you think about it, this is a far more slightly tangential but important aspect, because it's kind of related to the whole project as well. Madness in the 16th century, for example, was seen as a form of divine knowledge in some sense. So if you talk about, say, Twelfth Night, for example, by Shakespeare, Feste is the fool, and he's seen as incredibly clever. Go back even to the Iliad, and Cassandra is seen as some sort of oracular sort of beacon of light, really, who just is misunderstood by everyone else because of the god Apollo. But you see, in the was it the 19th century? I think no, it was in the 17th century. For the first time, we saw the incarceration of the mad and all who are seen as as pathological, right? Um, in that sense, then you could say that these are what I was trying to make. If you were to go back to what I'm saying, I think you could say that this sort of distinction which we are having at the moment is sort of born out of a desire to control, right? It's a desire to under anything that we can we can identify with, we have to understand. And that's an epistemic shift which came about by the split philosophy and science, split between science and religion. This kind of epistemic construct, which was stemmed from the Cartesian tradition, is beginning to spread to our identity in and of itself. And now we're no longer trying to control the forms of knowledge or the categories of knowledge which are being sort of being identified with, but we are trying to sort of understand and control ourselves. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's simply the shift of the psychic consciousness in regards to all the things that have happened before. But nonetheless, I think that the construct, I think, is really the mode the way in which we're going about it. The mode of interpretation is the problem. Do we approach this with reductive certainty, absolute certainty, or with the construct of faith? And by faith, I don't mean necessarily religious faith, but I mean more so with something which is able to move forward and live in spite of uncertainty. I think that is fundamentally what I'm trying to kick back against. I'm trying to kick back against the Cartesian tradition of absolute certainty. And Descartes, in the Meditations, his whole philosophy and soliloquy is all about, you know, he's the first person in the whole history of Western philosophy who started this tradition. Because beforehand we had people like Augustine, who wrote, I think in the City of God, he said something like, if I'm deceived, then I am, because there must be someone to deceive, to be deceived, to even, to there must be someone who exists to even be deceived in the first place. But you see, ultimately, Augustine didn't and never asked the question of how can I know something which is clear and distinct and absolutely certain. That was not Augustine's preoccupation, and he was really just trying to kick back against the academicians and the skeptics who believed that there was nothing to be known. But Descartes put in both traditions all in one, both the notion of certainty and the notion of skepticism. He pushed to two extremes, and then he combined them all into one. Now, what you have then are two types of selves being created. So one is this notion of self-control, which Taylor talks about in say sources of the self. Self-control, where we try to identify the self, we try to control the self, we try to uncover the self in all its essence and find this essence and then stick to it and believe in it rigidly. On the other hand, we have the notion of self-depth. So if you read Conrad's Heart of Darkness, the notion of going up a hill is similar to uncovering layers of identity. These two sources of the self are what envelop the current mode of identity which afflict the Western consciousness in such a way then that we could say that when we ask the fundamental questions of individual existence and individual identity, we are posing questions which are intertwined, are combining two of these traditions in one, and saying, who am I as a person? And if I, and then from there I can find my essential self. The whole notion of a category is trying to do this, right? So the psychologist Jung and his whole category of introvert, extrovert, all these kind of things, fairly recent stuff. These are all things which are highlighting these two strains of thought, really combining themselves together within our psychic consciousness. But my problem is, this is to some extent antithetical to the fundamental nature of human identity and existence. We are beings who are not born with reason initially. We're not born with, and we just think, okay, these are nine atoms on this piece of paper or whatever. We don't think like that initially. I mean, we're born with this fundamental uncertainty, and we just live on first with that, what I call an ontological faith. It's what we're just given initially. We're thrown into the world, and then from there, we start to ask ourselves the fundamental questions of why we live and how we live. But you see, this fundamental uncertainty will never leave us. So I think, sort of people like Gordell and his incompleteness theorem are sort of very helpful in sort of covering that. So yeah, I think that would be a more detailed answer of that question.
Brilliant, and I would love to push you further, but I think for the sake of this time, I know, and for the sake of this interview, we should move on to the second major aspect of your book, that of morality, and I suppose the how we can live ethically in our world, in our current
Mm,
moral order. And that's a very important question because, as you know, part of being human is to live in the world and to you raise Levinas. It's about kind of confronting that otherness that we kind of
mm,
ethics is the first philosophy. We interact with other people, and
mm,
I'm not sure whether you would go that far to say that's the first philosophy, but nonetheless, I would say that it is a very important part that we all have to question. And so I would like to perhaps have a two-pronged kind of question for you to answer. You could either answer them both at the same time or separately. Is first of all, what is our current moral order? What is the landscape that we find ourselves in as ethical
mm,
beings in this world? And secondly, what do you think is the best way to actually navigate it? Can we even make any prescriptive claims of this or
mm,
descriptive claims of this moral order, or
mm,
where are we standing in relationship to it?
yeah, that's a very interesting question. Current moral order is shambles, to put it kind of briefly. What I mean by that is the question of plurality is something which we're facing far more deeply now than ever before. It was fine before when we didn't have that much globalization and things were far more sort of sectarian and parochial. But now, when everyone is telling you their own philosophy and their own lived experience and their own identity, even on a political level, we struggle with the question of social cohesion and the limits of liberty. Those are the questions which we're facing right now. And even with social media, think about Twitter bans, think about, all the people who have been doing that. So really, we're asking the question of to navigate the questions of plurality and difference. Even think about, countries with power, for example, right? I mean, the most powerful countries in the world at the moment. Think about America and then, China and all these kind of things. We, you know, if you when we think about sort of, the different things that they do in different countries in Afghanistan or all these different things, we are all kind of, you know we're all kind of debating about how much we can really do, given that this is a totally different culture and totally different people and totally different beliefs, whilst at the same time still sticking to the things that we believe and fundamentally think is a human right for everyone. So these are all very interesting questions. Think about even the Judeo-Christian values, which of course have, influenced and dominated the West for 2,000 years. We are seeing a fundamental rejection in these values, a sort of a reactivist thinking from certain countries, in Islamic countries in Asia and sort of Middle East. So you could sort of, can't remember exactly where exactly, but Tom Holland mentions this when he talks about Dominion. So if you guys are more interested, you can look at his interview. But when you think about all of these different things, I think really, if you were to say what is the shape of the modern moral order, the world would be a shambles, right? But um, so I think, how do I start to navigate that? Uh, well, I think what I've really been I've taken to is quite a few concepts from Nietzsche. I still know a couple from him and Petočka. So and I made a few myself. But what I'm influenced by fundamentally at the moment is Nietzsche's concept of amor fati.
Hmm.
And the other thing I'm interested by is an article Petočka wrote about the spiritual person and what it means to be a spiritual person. So I think I could go into both of them. We could start with Nietzsche. So Nietzsche, has this notion of amor fati, and to our viewers who may not know what that means the love of fate. And what does this mean? Nietzsche's concept of amor fati is interesting because what it means, in some sense, on an individual level, if we were to ask the question of morality and how we are to live our lives, how do we navigate that in such a way that we do not destroy ourselves or lose our sense of confidence in who we are because of the value structures that we uphold and the ideals that we have for ourselves? In some sense, heroism is something which is part and parcel of humanity, because what it means to be heroic is to simply stand in the face of groundlessness, with the affect of bravery, to affirm in the face of boundless possibility. That's what it means to be heroic. It means to be an eternal struggler, and in the face of life suffering, and difficulty. Now, of course, this is something which, even without being religious or being religious, we can all can appreciate. If you think about things, or modes of entertainment which are becoming increasingly popular, a lot of them are really about heroes, right? So ultimately, you can see how the psychic consciousness in the West is gravitating towards a moral structure which is far more interested, less so with the question of identity, but with the question of of heroism. Now and then, if you could say, how then are we to navigate this? Okay, one figure who I've been fascinated by for a very long time is Augustine of Hippo. And I read his confessions a few years ago, and it was an immensely moving experience for me reading those confessions. But one thing you can see with Augustine is a very deep sense of remorse, and this carries on with a lot of the way he describes a lot of the things he says. Now, I think one tendency which someone could have in our generation, if you were to read the confessions, for example, or if you were to reflect on your own life and see any of the mistakes that you've made, you might be tempted to, and I'm not saying Augustine did this in particular, or anyone, because I mean the whole notion of repentance is to sort of to have the humility to recognize your fallibility and not just realize that God loves you regardless. But I think one thing you could be tempted to is to look at any of these paradigmatic grand saints and be so intimidated that you start to wonder whether or not you can ever be like them, or whether or not you could ever really move beyond any of the problems that you have at the moment, or or failures that you have, or flaws, etc., etc. So, in some sense, the notion of amor fati is a redeeming concept, and it's a redeeming concept I got the sense, you see, even before I read Nietzsche, when I read the Confessions and I compared, say, Augustine to Aquinas, I was like, yeah, but Augustine has his own sort of charisma from the sort of the sort of the perspective of someone who has repented, which Aquinas, as charismatic as he could be, will not have in some sense because he has been, he's been devout all his life. There is something about a figure who is human in and of itself and who has moved beyond that, which is encouraging. And there's a sort of charisma which that person could have that someone who has always been devout would not have. And this is not to say that either of them are not praiseworthy, but there is something about individual human lived experience and about what you can bring to the picture, which is individual and only yours and no one else's. In this sense, really, then you could say, okay, what did Nietzsche mean by the love of fate? We can delve into that deeper. So he talks about this notion of the eternal recurrence, right? And the eternal recurrence is just asking yourself fundamentally, if you were to go back to your into your past and live out all the experiences again and again and again, and would you affirm it or would you try to change it? That was Nietzsche's fundamental question. If you can affirm it, then you've reached the highest state, to Nietzsche, the state of Rausch, or the great state of intoxication, power and bliss and joy. Now, in some sense, Nietzsche, by talking about this, he is reacting to a very a more so far more Puritan mm, aspect in religion, and going into a deeper notion of self acceptance. But this is not really slothful, right? Too much of our society today is kind of slothful. You read all these things, or you see all these different things in pop culture or memes or whatever. God is dead, and and there's no meaning and stuff like that. These are excuses to be negligent and sort of what's the word for it? Sort of self complacent. But this is not what Nietzsche means by that. Nietzsche more so realizes that within every experience that we have, every experience that forms our identity has a unique value, because when we look back upon it, whether or not we have whether or not we have sort of whether or not we could avoid it or not, really, it's a different thing altogether. But but the fact that we can sort of realize the fact that, one, realize our fallibility, and at the same time also realize the value to be found in our fallibility. Think about it. And, if you go back, say, to the Chinese temple, the history of the Shaolin temple is actually something very interesting. um the monks were trying to sort of defend themselves against wild animals and stuff like that, and obviously they had to start developing martial arts. So eventually, then they developed this whole thing where they could find all the different acupuncture points of the body and stuff like that, and that's how we're able to sort of defend ourselves. Think about martial arts. If you know all the weak points of your enemy, then you can sort of more effectively sort of attack them and sort of kill them, right? So in some sense, really, it's kind of knowing your flaws and knowing how to kind of make the most of them as a result of that. That's what amorfati is to an extent. For me, it means kind of understanding all your vulnerabilities and all your flaws and realizing that as part of that, knowing these things and acknowledging them, and part of those experiences are what have shaped you and your own unique sense of charisma and value at this point in time. So then it's not that you have been complacent, but it's more so that the value structure which you have at the moment is educated by the experiences which you've had in the past, and it's given you a unique perspective on life, your own unique flavor, your own unique sort of disposition. So when we think about paradigmatic heroes, for example, the grand heroes of of history, and whoever, I mean, they're different. It's hard to kind of categorize, people. They're the conquerors, they're thinkers, and all these kind of things. But you see, there could definitely be a tendency, which is far more Greco-Roman elitist tendency, to sort of see some people as ontologically higher or not or than others. Achilles did this, in the Iliad. But fundamental to not only our Judeo-Christian idea, but even to the state of the modern moral order at the moment, is this belief that we hold these truths to be self-evident, as the U.S. Constitution says, that all men are equal, right? So, in some sense, if we were to understand this sort of relation, then you could say that what is it about us and each and every one of us that we can bring to the table? You see a lot of these sort of motivational videos online sometimes, which almost refer to sort of success and power and money as sort of the mediums which you can kind of you know gain some sort of self-worth or self-acceptance. Sometimes it's overemphasized, if you see what I mean. And I think it's overemphasized because not everyone can be an Aquinas or an Augustine. These are things which I mean, not only demand ability, but they also demand a unique temperament and disposition to kind of live that kind of very, very intense life. So then, in some sense, really, if no one can be in Aquinas or Augustine, does that mean no one has a unique value? I don't think so. In some sense, I think Therese of Lisieux, for example, is a very good example of this. The saint who is known to be ordinary but in an extraordinary way. I think in some sense, really, there's a unique value which everyone can bring to the table as a result of their own life experience. But as a result, then, in order for you to harness this, it's important that the two most important things that we continually do, regardless of our identity, Christian or not, religious or not, is stay authentic to who we are and strive continually towards becoming the best version of ourselves possible. Because as long as we are honest with ourselves and the shadows which lurk within, then where danger is grows the saving power also. And this is me quoting Heidegger's question on technology. So in some sense, we could say the danger of our existential angst, in regards to our current generation, is also a danger which poses far more potential for us than ever before, because you see, the problems of identity weren't really, that pervasive back then. They weren't really, no one was really concerned. For an ancient Greek, for example, actually, there was no notion of homosexuality for the ancient Greeks. There was no notion of bisexuality or homosexuality. You were just, it was seen as a sort of a form of an activity rather than something which defined you or identity. For us, obviously, it's quite different, and I don't think that's necessarily a problem. It could be, or it could be not. It just depends on whether or not we're able to harness that, um, to maximize our potential. In some sense, we're able to harness that danger.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting summary of the problem, and I do want to talk about heroism, and we will be touching on that very quickly. But you did note something about a convert's faith, or I suppose Augustine's charisma of being a convert.
Mm,
I wonder what you would view as the role of conversion, or almost a paradigm shift, or I suppose enlightenment within one's life, and how that, I suppose, interacts directly to one's moral experience. Because I suppose when I think about my own life and I look at my personal development through the
mm,
years, it's very rarely, of course, there's gradual development, but what
mm,
causes that gradual development to occur is always a moment. It's a spark, and you're like, well,
mm,
okay, I've been living a bad life in the past, like in an almost an Augustinian way. It's like, I lived a sinful life, now I need to do better. Of course, that
mm,
doing better is a journey that we're on as Christians till the day we
mm,
die. But nonetheless, it's that kind of that moment which really stands out. I was wondering what you think is the role of a convert, and also if someone is perhaps as a cradle Catholic,
mm,
or even someone who's brought up in a Christian background,
mm,
what could be their moment of conversion, even if it's not necessarily, oh, I'm changing a religion or I'm changing
mm,
my worldview significantly. Do they
mm,
need a conversion in that case? How would you
yes.
approach that?
You see, that's very interesting. I think it's a very beautiful question to an extent, because when you can ask the fundamental question which I've been asking myself for a very long time now, which is, what does it really mean to be a saint, right? This is the
Mm.
goal of every Christian nowadays. It's give me 1 second. Yeah, so the goal of every Christian, especially Catholics, is to be a saint. And so one thing I asked myself a lot of my youth when I read a lot of these saints, I'm still young, but I mean much younger anyway, was you know what does it really mean to be a saint? And I think to be a saint is someone who every single action, thought, belief, or will is permeated and educated by the value structure which you believe in. In some sense, then, when you're very, even your breathing, every form of breath, every breath you take, every action you speak, every action you take, every word you speak, when you can you sort of link it all back to that value structure, which is at the top of your value hierarchy, unrelentingly, and devoutedly. When you can reconcile that with yourself, then you know that you've reached a state of a high state of perfection. You see, but you see, ultimately, then it's interesting because when you read the saints, you realize that a lot of them are very extremely humble. That's the word to use, right? Faustina, for example, in her diary, she sort of she's literally jots down sections where she was like, "Today I committed 23 sins, and I'm so ashamed of these, and I don't want to do them. And ultimately, then you could kind of look at that, and even Aquinas himself, it was said that when his confessor heard some of the stuff he said, it was like the sins of a 5-year-old, but he would weep over them, and copiously sometimes, and then just sort of be very contrite about it. Augustine, similarly, when people read the Confessions, I've oftentimes heard some remarks like he's just been sort of you know sort of exaggerating his conversion, something like that. Like he's exaggerating his sins or something like that. It's interesting. Every single one of these saints who are at the highest pinnacles of possibility in regards to human perfection, you could call them, so to speak, geniuses of morality, are still extremely humble. And you could ask the question, why? Right? Because I mean, you'd expect maybe that if you have reached that level, then you'd probably speak a little bit more like, like a veteran or something of that sort. Um, I think the main reason for that is because with great power comes great responsibility, right? And I think when we have say, I think when I realized this a lot more was when Padre Pio as well is another example. But when I realized this a lot more is when I read the dialogue between Gemma Galgani and Jesus Christ. She committed some sin, and all of a sudden Christ appeared to her and he said that I expect more of you than most people, just because of the graces that I've given you as well. And so then I think when you kind of think about it like that, I think that you are never really immune from danger, or immune from sin, or immune from growth and development. Really, it's always constant warfare. I mentioned that earlier, that to be a hero is to be an eternal struggler. Well, to reach the highest state of perfection, one must be in constant battle with oneself. As Newman says, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to change often. So to be perfect is not really a state of staticness. It's not like I have reached a state of perfection now, and no higher level can be reached. Especially when it comes to human perfection, it's a state of constant warfare and constant fighting with oneself, saying yes to war, opposition, and becoming. These are the traits of one who has reached a state of perfection. And so then, in some sense, to reach a state of perfection is not to be immune from failure or weakness. It is rather to realize that the affect of bravery in the face of groundlessness is always the way forward, to get there. Now you could say then, okay, now the role of the convert. I think the role of the convert is particularly interesting. You see, because it's big is raising that big epistemic question of truth, which has fascinated we philosophers for an incredibly long time now. Um, Theologians alike, to be fair. So it's the question of truth is really sort of when this is something which Patočka raised as well. The history of philosophy is pretty much based on Herculean minds really disagreeing with each other fundamentally, right? It's not something like science where Einstein and Newton would create some groundbreaking discoveries and bang, everyone agrees. Well, I mean, everyone agrees after a very long time. And or Euclid, for example. I think math is definitely far better example. Euclid has published stuff which even till today, no one disagrees with, and it's a fundamental axiom of mathematics. Philosophy is a case where Socrates will come along and say one thing, Plato will say another, Aristotle will disagree with the forms, and then Nietzsche will come how many centuries later and completely disagree with everything Plato and Aristotle had to say, and say that they were sort of promoting a tradition which is anti to the Greek spirit of cheerfulness. That's what Nietzsche says in the Twilight of the Idols. So, I mean, when you look at all this stuff, you can really look back and go back and say, this is how I felt growing up. I looked at all of these philosophers and I felt like, okay, if this guy who's clearly one of the greatest philosophers and this other guy who's another one of the greatest philosophers, so they're all disagreeing with each other, then where's the truth? I mean, think about it. Even on a plebeian level, you as a if we are not some of these great minds, or not yet anyway, then it's a case of like how if these people are disagreeing with each other, then how are we to find the truth in our own little parochial world, right? But then I realized that the question of truth and the question of identity is something which is far more individual in some sense, and this doesn't mean that there is no truth whatsoever, or that all truth is just subjective, but it means that in some sense, really, I think that what I fundamentally believe in, and even without this belief, you can still hold it, whether or not you're religious or not. So I believe that in some sense, really, God has put people in the world like different sort of like different flavors in some sense, like different Chesterton says love is division. And in some sense, really think about how authenticity is brought forth in the world. Authenticity is brought forth by the constant collision of ideas and sort of the fighting, and war. That's how, in some sense, we are forged. We are forged by obstacles, hardships, strength, and resolve. So when you can look upon one who is other from you, look into the face-to-face encounter with the other, um, your horizons are broadened. In some sense, the question of alterity, which Levin has raised, is always a question which is based on the notion of how can I, as a human being, stay open to the other and respect the face of the other in such a way then that by respecting the face of the other, I grow with the others, the other grows with me. In some sense, really, the notion of alterity which Levin has raised, particularly when he raised it in the 20th century with the barbarism or the fascist structures and all these kind of things, are problems which continue to face us today, regards to how do I deal with otherness, the problem of sameness and difference. Regards to identity, for example, as Catholic Christians, we're called to try and bring people to the faith in some sense, right? And in some sense, that is a fundamental mission which we have, to live like Christ did, be light of the world and salt of the earth. On the other hand, of course, what we do not want is violence. Nietzsche. It's not Nietzsche. It's Levinas. Levinas later on in his career, particularly when he realized Heidegger's Nazis, tendencies, he was very disturbed because this was a philosopher who he deeply admired. So he wrote a work, Being and Otherness, where he speaks about being and the desire for um, the uniformity of being as a form of violence. And now, when you think about it like that, I think fundamentally, then the question of plurality is not something which I think we can go away from. Actually, I don't think that there will ever be a point where everyone would agree on everything, but I don't think that that's necessarily a problem either. I think that the beauty of life is really being able to um, diversify our opinions and collide with each other. That's how we grow and develop as persons. That's how we fundamentally ask ourselves what we believe in. That's how we own ourselves and are not just blinded by the day and the group in some sense. Um, and in some sense, really, then think about it. Our relation to God is one of love in some sense, and our desire is to be free, because freedom is what allows for the boundless possibilities which are latent within our being to be uncovered. So, if we are to be free, fundamentally, then we cannot just simply have one option given to us. We need to have a bunch of options given to us. And then from there, we need to dig deep into ourselves and ask, what does it mean for I as a human being to live in this world? And what is it that I want to choose? And what is it that I want to make of myself? That's how we start to live in some sense, by making a choice. But you see, this existential choice, this calling, this either or, is fundamental, fundamental to our being in the world and to our identity. It's what makes us beautiful. So when I look at all these philosophers, there's some people I admire. Say, for example, Nietzsche, I have deep admiration for, even though I disagree a lot when I read him. But I fundamentally admire a lot of things about Nietzsche, and I think that it's part of that sort of openness, staying open to the other and constantly questioning yourself, that will allow us to actually maximally develop ourselves in whatever way we want to develop ourselves. We are also, so to speak, almost actors, and we're all in a play, and each one is given their own opinion, but that doesn't really take away from the beauty of any opinion. It just means that in some sense, if we really have to fundamentally believe in what we are believing in, then we must believe in it to the fullest. We must ask ourselves to the fullest, and live that, because that way then you can say, regardless of what happened, I have no regrets. I can live with Amorfati, because I went deep into myself, and I found the answers that I was looking for. I found the answers which were right for me. To me, honestly, I think those are the most important things. It was interesting because Aquinas, I think, was asked the question of whether or not I heard this from a priest, by the way. I haven't read it myself, so I have to confirm. But Aquinas was asked the question of whether or not, if an atheist did not believe in God, he should believe in God anyway out of fear. And Aquinas said that it will be better for an atheist to not believe in God than to believe in God out of fear. Actually, it's better for him to actually stay authentic to what it is that he believes. And in some sense, I think that way, that even if it's 2 nanoseconds before they die, or even at the point of death, I think that way we can kind of see that way is the way, the path to salvation, right? One last thing I'll say is Newman talks about the conscience, and he says that the conscience is the aboriginal vicar of Christ. So one of the most interesting things I read about, when I was dealing with this question, Newman was asked the question of, okay, would you toast to the Pope when he sits on his seat ex cathedra, papal infallibility? And he said, yes, I will, but I'll toast the conscience first. And this to me was very interesting. Newman was living the child of the 19th century, the child of authenticity, the child of the Romanticism movement, and he was already predicting a lot of the things that we're dealing with at the moment in regards to authenticity. Before and above anything else, really, the conscience is the first, and is the first resting place. Um, and so a similar thing as well with Kierkegaard and repetition. He was asked, if this religious thinker, if this religious person was to pray to God, and but they did not actually believe in God, what they believed in was an image of Him, then that's a form of idolatry in some sense. But if some unbeliever pray to God with the right values in their heart, deep inside, they looked into themselves, what we call the natural law is really, to me, this sort of notion, this notion that deep within ourselves, if we stay authentic to our truest feelings, we'll find God latent within our hearts. We'll find the light, and this light is something that sparks forward. It shines in every heart of, it's like a candle in some sense. It burns, and it vigorously, regardless of time or epoch or culture. These flickers of fire are necessary to emanate and give hope to people, in times of despair, in times of groundlessness, in times of desperation. That's when heroes are born.
Hmm. And you do touch upon heroes, and that kind of segues into the last section of this discussion. There's a few things I want to talk about heroism with you. The first thing is to say, well, what actually is a hero in your I suppose hermeneutics and in your philosophy? Is
Mm,
it I suppose this kind of intellectual genius, someone who is very smart, someone who's I suppose very intelligent, someone who's morally very perfect, maybe a saint that you're thinking about? Is it someone who has a lot of influence on society? Because there are a lot of models in which someone can be considered a genius, and they
mm,
all seem to be a genius in different ways. What is genius or even heroism to you, and are those two even the same thing? Can you use genius and
mm.
heroism interchangeably?
Yeah, that's interesting, and because there's definitely a distinction between them for sure. But
Mm,
ultimately, if you fit my sort of my horizon, my understanding of genius, you would probably have to have some heroic aspects of it, within it, because I definitely would disagree with any sort of physicalist understandings of genius as a sort of purely IQ test and stuff like that. I think that geniuses
mm,
are people who are responsible for the cultural and social evolution of mankind in some sense. And so they stand at the pinnacle of human ability within a certain narrow domain. They have exceptional abilities, and as a result, they inspire, they motivate, and they benefit the lives of others. These are fundamental traits of geniuses, regardless of whether or not they want to or not. And so, in some sense, then you could say, what is genius? I mean, or heroism, like I said, to be a hero is to be an eternal struggler. We are all born in this life with a fundamental state of epistemic and existential groundlessness, and this groundlessness and uncertainty necessitates faith as our fundamental ontology. It necessitates the courage to move forward in the face of possibility, the courage to affirm and assent to propositions which guide our lives fundamentally in the face of boundless possibility. So, in some sense, really, that's what it means to be a hero. To be a hero is to be an eternal struggler, because you will never really fully gain power to simply stand um, unfaced by difficulties, but you can gain a spirit which can grant you boundless power to be undaunted in the face of countless obstacles, because you realize that he that is in you is greater than he that is in the world. That could be religious or not, you know. But what I mean by that is simply that, as a steward of becoming, humans are fundamentally capable of endless growth and development. And what these geniuses are representative of the models of life affirmation. They heroes and geniuses are models of life affirmation. When I talk about heroes or genius, I don't mean genius in simply one sense. I'm not talking about simply intellectual geniuses. Those are one aspect. You could talk about artistic geniuses like Picasso. You talk about sport geniuses like Ronaldo, Messi. You could talk about loads of different people. Anyone who stands at the pinnacle of human ability within any narrow domain of expertise, a certain domain of expertise, is a genius in some sense, and we refer to these people as geniuses. So fundamentally, then, now the question, I suppose, the bigger question would be how would that relate to the project in some sense? Because you see, my question is all about how we can maximally develop ourselves. Now, if geniuses are standing the highest possibility of the highest pinnacle of possibility within a certain domain, then clearly have something to tell us about how much we can develop ourselves. They clearly tell us how much possibility is latent within human capacity, right? When you think about sort of the sort of the achievements of people like Newton or Einstein, you don't even need to go to them. Loads of different people throughout history. You could look at them and you could say, "Wow, so this was possible," right? So Usain Bolt is a fairly common, it's a far more the word for it, fairly recent, recent example. But in some sense, before he broke the world record, 9.58 seconds, it was believed to be impossible, to run under 9.6 seconds. Ben Johnson was the quickest. Before that, it was hard to even conceptualize. Not only did he break the world record, he completely demolished it, and he demolished it twice. Now you could say, what are heroes then? You see, eventually what happens is, because we are human beings who are predicated on faith and reason, right? Aquinas, faith and reason. Fundamentally, then what happens is our understanding of reality is predicated on having a certain glass ceiling effect, which we understand to be the limit of human capability. And this is not just problematic; it's also practical, right? Think about it. No one expects you to start floating rather than walking if you're in a rush, right? No one expects you to do that because no one thinks that human beings have wings and they can fly. So ultimately, then the glass ceiling effect is a limit of human capabilities, what we believe that we can achieve. Now, what heroes do is they look at the glass ceiling effect and they look at the people who have broken them beforehand, and they say, well, everyone who has broken this glass ceiling before has had the courage to move forward in the face of uncertainty. They've had the courage to live with faith in spite of fear and insecurity and terror, and to look deep into their shadows, really, to look into the abyss, question themselves, and find out that this is what they're called to. This is what their will aligns with. This is what their disposition, and so therefore living uncompromisedly in pursuit of that ideal can allow them to live with no regrets, can allow them to live with amor fati, to love themselves, to affirm themselves in the face of success or failure, to realize that this is as representative of the eternally noble. In some sense, then to break free of this glass ceiling effect and to see the other side is to uncover the horizon of human possibility and that boundless possibility which is yet to be uncovered. That to me is what genius is and what it represents.
That's a really beautiful presentation of this, and perhaps developing on that, the only question which follows is: are we all called to be geniuses? Because I suppose in Nietzsche, the Übermensch isn't necessarily something where everyone has to be an Übermensch. What's
Yeah.
your approach to it? Does everyone need to, in your worldview, need to be a
Mm.
genius, or
Yeah, I think definitely not. I don't think it's practical for anyone to be a genius. You see, the whole notion of genius in the first place is genius is paradigmatic, right? It's a model which everyone else is meant to follow. So ultimately, there would be no understanding of genius if everyone was a genius. That's the whole notion of genius. The price of greatness is rarity. So ultimately, then and for the paradigmatic heroes, really, loneliness is the norm. Company is an exception. You think about any paradigmatic heroes, and what I mean by that is not even necessarily on a social level, because some are antisocial, some are social. So Newton, for example, was quite antisocial. Um, but it's more so on the notion of, if you stand at the top of any pyramidal scheme, then you realize that just because you are at the top, no one else is there. It's a pretty lonely playing field, and that's the price you have to pay. Because in some sense, really, then once you're navigating through those boundaries, and we don't even need to talk about this in regards to the greatest of geniuses. Just think about it, even on a very practical level, right? If you, as a student at uni, or writing whatever you're writing, and you're navigating some path which have never been walked before, you're doing your own research, once you start to actually present original stuff, which is just not just regurgitating stuff that you've learned before, it's very exciting, but it can also be slightly terrifying, because you're also like, what if I'm just deluded? Like, I'm trying to like criticize Heidegger here, like, give me the authenticity, you give me the authority to do that. And like that's ultimately sort of what genius is in some sense, and that's why it's so encouraging. It's so beautiful to see, because what you're seeing is the affect of bravery in the face of groundlessness, really, the courage to move forward in the face of adversity, the courage to accept life in the face of difficulty, really. And that's what genius is in some sense. So in some sense, really, genius and heroism, not everyone is called to be a genius, but everyone is called to be heroic. And there's normative and sort of paradigmatic heroism. These are two different concepts. So in some sense, really, you have to undertake what I call an oath of the heroic. And the oath of the heroic is to say that regardless of what life throws at you, in spite of the difficulties or challenges which life throws at you, you will always stay true to the values that educate your heart and soul. If you stay true to these two things in spite of difficulty, then you can look back and see that there are things which transcend the imminence of the moment, the difficulties which pervade your current self. And then, in spite of the where was I? I was on normative heroism. If you can take an oath of the heroic, really, it's a case where, in spite of the difficulties which life throws at you, you'll forever stay true to the ideals that govern your heart and soul. I think these, to me, are the most beautiful things that one can take on. That's what it means to be a saint as well, in some sense, because think about it. People like Marcus Aurelius, immensely charismatic, one of the greatest probably leaders we've ever seen in human history. um he wasn't Christian, right? And you see, so a lot of people who we can admire are really not necessarily religious thinkers, but you see, I don't think that they have violated the fundamental essence of what we are called to, the natural law which lies within our heart, and the cause which God has called us to. In some sense, then your path as a human being is to carve out your own light and to find your own Tao. And some sense, then what when where there is a will, there is a way. If you stay true to who you are and your truest feelings, if you constantly question yourself and stay open to the authority of the other, then you will eventually find yourself, because you're willing to lose yourself.
Hmm. So perhaps to finally end off this video, let's end off with one question. You said in the past that people often view madness as a form of divine inspiration. People turned to the madmen and said they had something there, they
Yeah,
experienced something.
yeah,
Is that the price of being a genius? In some sense, did these ancients, did Homer, did they kind of touch on something where the true madmen of our times
mm,
are actually the geniuses, and they kind of stand out in an odd way? And is this kind of burden of the genius worth it, if it
yeah.
really is this burden?
That's interesting. I think that's true in a twofold sense. The first sense is that, honestly, the life which these geniuses lived, I've studied them for nearly 7 years now, or something of that
Hmm.
sort. It's it's an utter, it's incredibly intense, right? It's a life of intensity, complexity, and pressure, and you kind of wonder, like, what kind of person is driven to live like this, unless you
Hmm.
must have some kind of divine insanity within you, in some sense. What you just talked about now with the madness is essentially a concept I've coined, literally the word I just said right now, the divine insanity. I think there is a sense in which, really, when you are called to something to a point where this is the only way you can find respite and happiness, then it's simply something you have to stick to regardless of the difficulties that you faced. And so, really, what happens with geniuses is that they tend to be quite univocal. In some sense, really, they make immense sacrifices, and as a result, their lives are not very balanced. In some sense, they don't necessarily do much other than what it is that they're interested in. Maybe that's the price you have to pay. The price of greatness is rarity, like I said. So, like I said, with paradigmatic heroes, loneliness is the norm. Company is an exception. Think about Nietzsche or Kierkegaard or Plato, Aristotle. None of these people were really seen minds in their times that were anything like them. But you see that, look at their lives as well. When you read, I think one of the best people to read to understand this is Avicenna. You read his biography. What he did as a teenager is just simply, to get to where he went, is just, it's extraordinary, right? Like 16 to 8, he was a doctor by 16, by the way, but 16 to 18, he pretty much just holed himself up in a library, and he just read nonstop, for 2 years straight. And you look at that, then you say, okay, when throughout history, really, if we look throughout history, the horizon of human history, there are very, very few prodigies who can compare to Avicenna. But look at the sacrifices that he put into that. Do you think that kind of person who would just hold himself up in the library for 2 years straight, and then immediately he went out, he blew up and was seen as this world leading philosopher? Do you think he was really able to really talk with people, in his age group, and like really just have normal friends and just do things, on a normal level? I think kind of struggled with that, honestly. He was a bit lonely in that sense, because I mean, if you were to try and like talk to an 18-year-old, another 18-year-old in Isfahan or something, and like, do you understand the four humors and all these different things, and they will be like, look at you like some one in a creature. So, like,
Yeah,
it's that's the kind of intensity and complexity and pressure which you can kind of look at and say, I can see the grandeur, I can see the majesty, but I can also see the difficulty as well. So it's something that you have to ask yourself: are you called to it? A lot of people romanticize genius; they don't realize the sacrifice that it takes to get there. So that's one of the reasons. You have to be insane. You have to be slightly mad to do it. The other thing about madness, though, is like they said, the second way you can be mad is when the zeitgeist is not receptive to your mode of thinking. So Nietzsche is probably one of the best examples for this. Nietzsche was 300 years ahead of his era or something of that sort, 200 years maybe. Yeah, because I mean, what was he writing about in the gay science? God is dead and we can kill him. Who can wash off the blood from our hands and all these different things? All these prophetic um, statements were wildly different from anything that were going on in the zeitgeist at the time because they were largely it's either at the time 80% dogmatism, religious dogmatism. So there was a say very people who read Nietzsche. He had a small cult following, but people, especially religious people, just it was just too much for them. They weren't able to really properly appreciate the brilliance of the thinker. It was only later on, really, when he died, that people see that he just blew up immensely. But he always knew he was going to do that. He literally writes a book at the end of his life. He's like, "Why I am so smart, like why I write such great books." It's crazy. But you said Nietzsche, but you see that's one thing. But you see, he had a very small cult following. But the other thing, the other section of the epoch were people who believe that when we do away with religion, everything will be fine and we'll be all jovial. And this is what Nietzsche is reacting to. Is an anti-enlightenment rationalist tendency which Nietzsche is reacting to, and it's honestly just speaking immensely profound for the time in which he was doing so, because no one is really thinking about morality as something which could be possibly culturally contingent, which could be influenced by certain values like Judeo-Christian values, like Confucian concepts, which we've seen being sort of inculcated as well, like Indian notions of Buddhism. Or no one was really seeing these things as culturally contingent, but really as universal eternal forms, Kantian notions. And Nietzsche for the first time is breaking down all of these things, asking the translation and reevaluation of values and all these different things. But it was just simply too revolutionary for the time. The epoch wasn't ready for it. So he was labeled as mad. So that's one way you can see a genius like Nietzsche. Beyond Good and Evil right now is a bestseller, which is never off the bestseller list. But at the time, it only sold about 200 copies, and then he got mad and blamed his publisher. But it's also just it's a case where you can kind of look into that and sort of see Nietzsche. There are times when a genius really might not so I think it might not be receptive for the era. Another example will be Einstein, right? When Einstein published the papers in the miracle year, the five papers which first off laid down the groundwork for a general relativity, the proving of the atoms, the photoelectric effect, all this, you know. When Einstein wrote those five papers, it was seen as utter madness. Initially, no one actually thought, some people thought it was promising, but no one actually realized how big this was for science until Einstein turned 40. So that was 15 years after he actually published the results itself. Because we're hardcore Newtonian physicists who believed in order. We didn't believe that time could be relative, that space could be bent, we could bend time and space and all that kind of stuff. So ultimately, then, when the epoch isn't receptive to the genius's thinking, then he could be labeled as mad. But it's not because he's mad, but because he's seen so deep into the future that we can't even begin to conceptualize the problems that he's facing and tackling. But you see, ultimately, it's this kind of people. Nietzsche, for example, you can say is definitely a model of life formation or faith, because you see, even when he sold his 200 copies, he still said, "I know my fate. I am no man. I am dynamite." The great geniuses are great explosives, and throughout history, they completely shape the modes of rationality and the thinkings, consciously or unconsciously, which we hold. These people are not only interested in them because they are great figures of possibility. That's simply one element. The other element is that everything that we think and do, to some extent, is influenced by some of the ideas that they have. So it's like, whatever doesn't kill you make you stronger. Like, these quotes which are so easily relatable right now, and that you need to just call them for anyone to see. That is from Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols, from Life's Military School: whatever doesn't kill you make you stronger. All of these things that we understand and think of, which are sort of self-evident to us right now, are simply the result of generations and centuries of prodding and plodding through the dark abyss of ignorance and uncertainty in search for some kind of light and purpose. But now we take this for granted, and heroism is dying off. But the reason it's dying off is not because we don't want it. Heroism is a light which everyone wants to see, even those in the darkness. But you see, it's because deep down we don't know how to reach it. We're in a state of angst. But if we can go down then deeper, even deeper into what we are fundamentally, our human nature, if you can understand then the danger of our epoch, then I believe that there will also be a saving power.
That's a fascinating and brilliant way to end off this video. My AirPods are currently ran out of battery, but I can still hear you with one ear. So,
Yeah.
but it is indeed in good time to end off this video. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion with Karol. I was definitely very interested in the different aspects. I mean, there's just so much to cover in this video, and I know we've just really skimmed really the top. There's just so many other questions I have, but that will have to be for another video. I suppose to end off this interview, Karol, is there any other way that people can find you? Podcasts, platforms, where can people find you?
I've got a podcast. It's called The Burden of Truth. I've got one episode out there, but we'll get some more in due time. Other than that, I think just mainly that at the moment, to be honest. But if you go follow me on the podcast and you see some episodes, and you can edit this part out, by the way. But I don't know if I should mention my Instagram but that's because that's a music channel there, so I don't know, probably not.
Well, that's very good. That's all right. Thank you very much for coming onto the channel once again. Make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about Karol's phenomenological approach, his views on heroism, his views on morality? What are your thoughts there? I'd love to hear your thoughts there. God bless. I'll see you soon.
It was a pleasure, Lou.
Nice one.